The Lighthouse is a psychological horror film directed and produced by Robert Eggers, and it is possibly one of the greatest character studies ever created. I would prefer if you watch the film before listening to my schizophrenic ramblings, but either way, I'll give you a brief synopsis of the film before we start. The film follows the young lighthouse keeper, or Wiki, Ephraim Winslow, under the supervision of the older, more experienced Thomas Wake. In the hour and a half we spend on the film, we witness the extreme psychological complexities that can exist within an individual, but also how those individual complexities face up against another, as we watch the relationship between these two men evolve from what we could call a mundane boss-employee dynamic into something far more sinister, visceral, and even primal, which makes this an amazing movie to attempt a sort of psychoanalysis of the characters. Because as Eggers himself said, it's a movie where both Jung and Freud would be furiously eating their popcorn. Freud believed that human beings are inherently creatures of desire. We are born following what he called the pleasure principle. The pleasure principle, or the id, being the immediate gratification of our wants and needs, and the deliberate effort of avoiding all pains, whether they are physical or psychological. So here, Freud, being much more of a thinker than a scientist, takes quite a pessimistic philosophical stance, as he believes that humans are not in fact social animals. The opposite. They are creatures of desire, and that it is only through being confronted with society and all of its various implications, the reality principle, that humans develop what he called the ego, which mediates between all of our lusts and desires and the constraints of reality and societal norms. Only then do we truly become social animals. Here we sort of have the base for this character analysis. At the Lighthouse, they are out of civilization. They do not have to contend with the reality principle, and so they become creatures of desire, operating on the pleasure principle almost exclusively, gratifying their wants and needs, even gratifying themselves, with little to no restraint. One of the most noticeable signatures of this movie is its perfectly square aspect ratio, and besides it being aesthetically interesting, more importantly, it hammers in the themes of isolation beautifully, and the overall broader fact that they really have no one else to contend to except for themselves. The Oedipus Complex is one of Freud's many controversial theories, and it refers to a son's subconscious psychosexual desire for his mother and general resentment towards his father. Robert Pattinson said this about the father-son dynamic between Winslow and Wake. I was pretty conscious of how I wanted the relationship to come across. In a lot of ways, he sort of wants a daddy. So it's pretty clear that Wake fulfills that role. He's definitely the authoritative figure throughout the movie, as in, he literally has full authority over Winslow, but also plays the role of teaching him and guiding him, much like a father would. And so, if Wake is his quote-unquote father, we could then see the lighthouse itself as the quote-unquote mother, as the subject of Winslow's desire, one which Wake already possesses.
See to your duties. The light is mine.
Freud also mentions that the son's contempt for his father can extend to the subconscious desire to kill him, or at the very least instigate his death in some way. And we can't ignore the fact that Winslow had at the very least participated in the death of his previous employer, if not killed him outright, and then took his name.
We saw the jam coming, and I stood, and he slipped. He shouted up, and I just stood there. I packed up his kit and fixings as if they was my own, and Ephraim Winslow, well, now he'd got a spiffy clean slate, and Thomas Howard, he don't.
And we of course can't forget that Winslow tries to kill Wake multiple times. In the Oedipus Complex theory, Freud mentions quite clearly that he believes this is something that happens early in a boy's childhood, and that it is the work purely of the infantile pleasure principle, or id. So in terms of analyzing this movie, The Oedipus Complex fits quite nicely with my previous theory that due to them being so detached from general civilization and the reality principle, and are therefore not utilizing their ego, they have reverted back to the more infantile, pleasure-driven id. Freud also argues that if this complex is not resolved, and the son is not able to identify with, or I guess make some sort of amends with the father, and fixates on his psychosexual possession of the mother, that he will develop a sort of neurosis, and will eventually become an over-aggressive, over-ambitious, vain man. But this is all very Freudian, so let's get into something a little more Jungian. Carl Jung's idea of the persona is a much less controversial theory that even has quite a lot of renown and is widely accepted in many intellectual circles. The persona is essentially the mask. It's our conscious projection of our personality, which we use to face the world, or which we present to others. Jung, being as much of a philosophical pessimist as Freud, argues that the persona is an essential part of one's psychological development, as long as it is well integrated into one's subconscious self, or your shadow, as Jung would put it. The personas here are fairly obvious. Wake takes on the persona of a wise older man, a tough but fair boss, and a veteran sailor who is knowledgeable in all things relating to the sea, including myths and legends, which we will get to a little bit later. His persona is very much on the nose. Even Winslow comments on it later on in the movie.
I'm tired of your damn fool yarns and your Captain Ahab horse. You sound like a goddamn parody.
But Winslow's persona is arguably even more blatant, seeing as he quite literally took on the name of his previous employer, who he may or may not have killed. His persona throughout the movie is fairly simple, which fits with his character's Freudian psychoanalysis quite well. It's simply that of a stoic hard worker looking for a better life.
Since I left Dad, I done every kind of work that can pay a man. Ain't nothing wrong with a man starting fresh, starting new, just looking to earn a living. No. Just like any man. Just want to settle down quiet like, some earnings.
However, since his oedipital fixation, general psychological degradation due to isolation, and reversion to a more infantile id, his persona begins to fall around the middle of the film. Wake, however, perhaps due to being more mature, holds on to his persona tightly until his very last breath.
And the fiddler's being sent where no man is suffered.
Then you have Jung's idea of the shadow. The shadow represents the unconscious, repressed aspects of an individual's personality, which they have not integrated into their conscious self, their persona. It's somewhat similar to Freud's idea of the pleasure principle / id. It's all of that unsophisticated, socially unacceptable, pleasure-seeking behavior we see the two of them exhibiting. In order for an individual to psychologically develop in a healthy way, he must integrate his shadow into his persona. Otherwise, his persona will be utterly inauthentic and it'll lead to neurosis, self-hatred, aggression, etc. This is why I believe the two of them cling onto the light of the lighthouse so desperately.
Please. Just let me into the light, old man. Just let me into that lantern, that's all. Don't make me beg. Or I'll beg. I'll beg. If that's what you want, I'll beg.
The light, metaphorically, eliminates the shadow and gives them a momentary false sense of clarity and self-awareness. But that's my theory of it anyway. This movie contains some references to mythological stories and figures, which I think are not only interesting, but are also vital to the overall understanding of these characters. First off, you have Proteus. Proteus is a classical Homeric figure from ancient Greece, known as the Old Man of the Sea, or the prophetic sea god, who is said to have the ability to foretell the future. This fits quite well with Wake's veteran sailor persona. But more importantly, this is, I believe, how Winslow sees him. Towards the end of the movie, when Winslow is strangling Wake, for a moment he sees his old boss, whom he took his persona from, and then sees Wake as Proteus, the prophetic sea god. This tells us that his view of Wake is even more extreme than we thought. He doesn't just see him as an authoritative father figure. The respect and fear he has for him is, I think, much, much greater. After all, Wake reads his intentions and his persona like an open book.
You make me laugh with your false grum. Ye pretended there's some mystery in your quietudes, but there ain't no mystery. You're an open book. A picture, says I. A painted actress screaming in the footlights. A bitch what wants to be coveted for nothing but being born, crying about the silver spoon what should have been yours. Now look at you.
He's given him more clarity and self-awareness than he has ever had. And we know that from the ending that Winslow just can't take it. I think it's important to mention here that Freud also had some thoughts on religion, or in this case, superstition. Freud believed it was a byproduct of a lack of an ego. So someone who is possessed by their id will look to religion or superstition as a replacement of a healthy ego that will tell them what is socially acceptable, what pleasures they should seek and which they should ignore, how to avoid pains, etc. To put it into more Freudian terms, they're looking for a daddy.
You a praying man, Winslow?
Not as often as I'd might, but I'm God-fearing, if that's what you're asking.
I think you can see how this fits into the psychoanalysis of these characters, more specifically Winslow. Next up we have the seagulls. Wake mentions that the souls of dead sailors reside in these seagulls.
Say, why is it bad luck to kill a gull?
In them's the souls of sailors, what met their maker.
As far as I can tell, this doesn't seem to be a myth that's documented in literature, but it is possible that it's a real folktale, as sailors always attributed all kinds of metaphysical properties to animals and even sometimes inanimate objects. However, the notion that killing a seagull is bad luck or has the power to change winds does have some literary background. It most likely comes from the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner by the English poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and was actually quite influential in England, along with its collection Lyrical Ballads, for being one of the first major literary bodies of work that could be considered part of the Romantic artistic movement, well, at least in England anyway. The story goes something like this. A ship full of sailors gets stuck in the ocean and they encounter an albatross, which is seen as good luck. However, one of the sailors kills the albatross because he thought it would be funny. It was. But it brought a curse onto the ship and its crew. They meet Death, who is just a really scary skeleton, playing dice with a very pale woman for some reason. The woman wins the life of the sailor who shot the albatross, and Death wins the lives of the crew. The crew then of course dies, and the sailor is left on Earth to tell his story as penance. Perhaps Wake is based on this sailor, although maybe a version of him that chose to seclude himself in order not to have to tell his story as penance. But that's just a theory. Again, no, I just made that up. 3/4 into the movie, after Winslow tells Wake who Ephraim Winslow truly is, when he spills his beans.
Why'd you spill your beans, Tommy?
We get one of the most recognizable shots in the movie. This fantastic shot is based on a real print by artist Sasha Schneider, simply called Hypnosis. I think this pairs so well with the Freudian themes of this movie, as I believe it encapsulates so much of the relationship between these two. You can really read it in two angles. From Winslow's perspective, it's what he feels is happening to him. He's being hypnotized by Wake's fatherly, wise older man, Proteus-esque persona, and that it was this seemingly metaphysical pull that caused him to quote-unquote spill his beans. The beans being revealing what happened to his previous employer and his real name, dropping his persona and truly revealing his shadow. Or also from Winslow's perspective, through Wake's eyes, he shines a light directly through Winslow, illuminating him clearly. He's been, again, read like a book.
A picture, says I.
And the second angle is, you can read it from just a general Freudian point of view. This shot is based on an artist who was quite open about the homoerotic themes of his work. And so this tells us that this movie is perhaps taking the Freudian perspective of everything is sexual. Even this father-son, teacher-student relationship has some sort of sexual undertones that motivate it, whether positively or negatively. It's the underlying cause that moves the relationship. This is kind of backed up by the deliberate overall phallic imagery in this movie. Hell, the lighthouse itself can be considered deliberate phallic imagery, as in an unused sequence of the film, a shot of the lighthouse was supposed to fade into Winslow's erect penis. I'm not joking, they really were gonna do that. I think the fact they used Sasha Schneider implies that there is a kind of figurative androphilic attraction going on. Winslow clearly respects and fears Wake to some extent, perhaps because Wake embodies some aspects that we might attribute to masculinity. He's the wiser, older man, the father, or the patriarch, you could say. But the opposite is also true of Winslow. Winslow is youthful, strong, capable, and stoic. And I think this might be the source of their respect, but also hatred and contempt for one another. That, paired with the id on full display, you get a full loveless fight for dominance between these two. This is such an amazing movie, and there's actually quite a lot of topics relating to the story that I didn't touch on due to not being really relevant to the overall theme of this video, being the Freudian and Jungian themes surrounding the characters. But I would argue that the characters are the most fascinating part of this movie, and their specific little idiosyncrasies are what drive the narrative. It's especially fascinating seeing as I don't believe these people or these characters are even particularly unique. And so, to finish off this pseudo-psychoanalysis, I'll leave you with a quote from the, I guess, kind of controversial American writer, Mark Twain. Let us consider that we are all partially insane. It will explain us to each other. It will unriddle many riddles. It will make clear and simple many things which are involved in haunting and harassing difficulties and obscurities.